Hi everybody, Joanne Carey's here with Easy Photoshop Magic. What I'm going to demonstrate now is how to create a realistic shadow. I've selected this illustration of a dog because he's cute. I obtained the illustration from a wonderful site that provides a lot of free resources for Photoshop, www.vector-eps.com. Check it out. You'll find a lot of cool, fun things there for your illustration work. So the first thing that I'm going to do is make sure that I'm on the correct layer, and I'm going to name it dog. And sometimes we get lost in layers, and so I like to name things so I can easily come back to them. And on this layer, I'm going to come up here to the Layers panel, right-click on the Magic Wand tool, and place it anywhere in the area that is basically white. So I'm going to left-click, and you see the marching ants all around the image. Look closely though, because underneath or inside the collar, that area is not selected, and here between the legs and the paws is another area that's not selected. The very next step is to make sure we have only the dog contour selected. So I'm going on my keyboard to invert the selection using Command-Shift-I or Control-Shift-I. There we go. Now you see that just the dog itself is selected. And the very next thing that we're going to do is come up here to the very top where we have the Refine Edge option. And we're going to make a smooth effect. I'll exaggerate it so you can see what happens when we go in one direction or another with the sliders. Basically what I'm after is a nice smooth edge that will look nice once this is on a white background. So let's just feather it a tiny little bit. And so I moved the feather slider up 1 pixel. See that I've missed a little spot here, so I'm going to click on it, and we managed to get rid of that. Now here under Output, let's select New Layer. That way we'll have the dog all by itself on a brand new layer. I'm going to click OK, and there we go. Now on this layer, Dog Copy, I can on my keyboard Command T or Control T. I'm on a Mac, so I'm using Command T, and that has essentially placed these transformed nodes around the selection. And notice what I did. On my keyboard with my left hand, or maybe it's your right, with one corner I selected the Shift key with my left hand, and with my right hand on the mouse I pulled the transform nodes so that the image of the dog can be smaller or larger, though that's completely within your control. So I'm going to let my left finger off of the Shift key and my right finger off of this transform mode, and I'm going to select OK right here at the top. Now Let me go back up to the Move tool, which I always use as my home base because I think sometimes one of the ways we get confused, whether we're beginners or advanced, is that we're using a certain tool, and then when we move to the next step, we're still on that same tool. And so it's always a good idea, at least for me, to go back to this Move tool. Now, I see here, before we move into the shadow, maybe it's difficult for you to see, but there is a slight white line that I'm not happy with. So I'm not sure where it is. Now, this is something that we run into all the time with Photoshop, with lines appearing we don't quite understand. So the way that I'm going to find it is by clicking on different layers and seeing if I can identify where it is. I'm going to take a guess here on the dog copy layer, and I'm going down to the bottom of the layers panel and selecting Add Layer Mask. Because with the layer mask, which now appears as a square, and with black selected as the foreground color, and by selecting the brush tool, I'm going to see if I can remove that line, and I did. Okay, so that's terrific. So now we have just the happy dog and no line following behind him. Now let's make a shadow. So I'm coming back over to this dog copy layer, and on my mouse I'm going to left click twice, which will bring up a layer style menu. So take a look. There is the layer style. I'm going to move it up here so we can see it. Now, on different versions of Photoshop, you will find the drop shadow in somewhat different positions on the list. This is Photoshop 6, and it belongs here at the bottom. So notice what I did. I clicked it, and that brought up this drop shadow layer style menu. And now, using these sliders, I can create a shadow. And I can do a lot of different things with it. So I can, depending on the angle, I can place it anywhere that it appropriately belongs. And by appropriately, I mean keep in mind where the shadow needs to fall depending on the direction of the light source. So for example, if the light is coming from the upper left towards the dog, we don't want the shadow to be in a place that's not realistic. So I'm just going to use the angle tool to show you how we place the shadow in such a way that if the light were coming from this direction, it would most likely, let's see, do something like that. Alright, so that is the beginning of the shadow. If I worked with the spread slider, I would get an effect like that with a somewhat of an outline around the edges of the shadow, which might be good for your illustration. The size really blurs it out, and again, it depends on what effect you want to create. But for the purpose of showing you how to work with a drop shadow, I'm going to click OK all the way up at the top right, and then come back to my layers panel. Now here right where it says drop shadow, I'm going to place my little hand tool, which is default, so you don't have to worry about selecting that. And on my mouse, click to the right and come all the way down to create layer on this menu. You will see this. Some aspects of the effects cannot be reproduced with layers. That's a default. Just click OK. Because what happens now is that we have the dog copies drop shadow on a separate layer. And remember, go back up to your move tool and now click on the drop shadow layer, because we now have the ability to move this all around the place. And this is what helps us create a realistic drop shadow. So my next step on my keyboard, either Command or Control and T. That's on the keyboard with my left hand. And that brings up these transform nodes again. Up here in the Edit menu, I'm going to select Transform, slide over here to Flip Vertical, which essentially flipped it vertically. And while I'm still on the Transform node selection, I'm going to, from the lower right hand corner, and with my left finger on the Shift key, just bring that up a little bit. Let's make it a little bit, something like that. Now, all right, so let's say that that's about as realistic as it might get. We can make it a little bit less opaque. So depending on the background and again what final effect you're trying to achieve, you can play with the opacity. But what is important is that the blending mode is multiply, so we definitely want to keep that intact. And again, on the drop shadow layer, we can move different ways. And again, on the keyboard, because I want to make sure that everybody understands and sees this a couple of times, either Command or Control, and then the T. And we have the rectangular transform nodes. On the keyboard, Shift, and if I want to make this flattened out, you see where my cursor is, it's doing that. Or expanding the shadow, something like that. I could do the same with the edges, if that makes sense. Remember, it has to make sense depending on the direction of the light. So here, let's say the light is coming from the upper right hand corner, and it will place a shadow in this direction of the dog. So that's the beginning of how to make a realistic shadow. And to finish things off, I'm going to take a snapshot of this and select snapshot 2. So if I wanted to save it, I can go to File, Save As. I can save it for the web, but this gives me the option to save it somewhere on my desktop as a PNG file, a JPEG file, a PSD file, so that the next time I open it, it will have all of these layers. So I've demonstrated how to create a realistic shadow. Try it by picking any illustration that you have on hand. Go to this site, Just start playing with it. Honestly, you'll make whatever mistakes seem realistic to you, and in the end, you'll have a realistic shadow. So have fun with this. Just play, and that's our easy Photoshop magic lesson. Enjoy. Bye for now.